The sound of splintering wood echoed across Crystal Lake as Margaret Henderson swung her sledgehammer into my deck railing for the third time. I stood there, coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips, watching this woman, in her perfectly pressed khakis and HO a President polo, systematically destroy the deck I'd spent 3 summers building with my own hands. "This unauthorized structure ends today, Mr. Coleman," she screamed, her face red with exertion and rage. "I don't care if you think you're above our community standards." Behind her stood 2 other HOA board members, Carl Patterson, with his clipboard clutched like a weapon, and Janet Mills recording everything on her phone with the smugness of someone who thinks they're documenting a victory. The morning mist was still rising off the lake, and here was this woman destroying my property before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. What Margaret didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 17 minutes, the Lake District Authority inspector I'd called the night before would arrive for his scheduled visit. And Margaret Henderson was about to learn why you never mess with someone whose family built half the infrastructure on this lake. But let me back up 6 months to when this nightmare started with a simple letter slipped under my cabin door. I'd inherited the cabin from my grandfather 3 years earlier. Grandpa Joe had built it in 1987, back when Crystal Lake was just a handful of scattered properties, and nobody cared if your deck jutted out a few extra feet or if your boat lift wasn't painted regulation beige. The place was my sanctuary, a rustic A-frame with knotty pine walls, a stone fireplace that actually worked, and that deck. God, that deck was beautiful. It wrapped around the entire lakeside of the cabin, with built-in benches, planters for my grandmother's roses, and a section that extended out over the water where I'd installed a small hot tub. Every board was hand-selected cedar, every joint carefully crafted. It was my masterpiece, my retreat from the corporate world, where I spent 60 hours a week managing municipal water systems. The letter was typed on official HOA letterhead, signed by Margaret Henderson in her flowing script that probably took longer to write than the actual message. "Dear property owner, it has come to our attention that modifications to your lakefront property may not be in compliance with current community standards. Please contact the Architectural Review Committee to schedule an inspection. Failure to respond within 30 days may result in enforcement action." I remember laughing out loud. Enforcement action? This was a lake community, not downtown Manhattan. I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the fireplace, watching it curl and blacken among the ashes of my weekend campfires. That was my first mistake. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later, this time hand-delivered by Margaret herself. I was out on the deck, grilling burgers and enjoying a beer, when I heard the sharp rap of knuckles on my front door. Through the window, I could see a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a blue polo shirt with Crystal Lake HO, a president, embroidered in gold thread. "Mr. Coleman?" Her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Margaret Henderson, president of the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your property modifications." I set down my beer and walked around to the front of the cabin. "Nice to meet you, Margaret. What can I do for you?" Her eyes immediately locked onto my deck, visible through the gap between cabins. "That structure," she pointed with a manicured finger, "extends beyond the approved building envelope. According to our architectural guidelines, no permanent structure can extend more than 10 feet from the primary dwelling's foundation." "My deck's been here for 3 years," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. "My grandfather built the original structure in '87. I just restored and expanded it." "Mr. Coleman," her voice took on a patronizing edge, "what was acceptable 35 years ago doesn't meet our current community standards." The HOA implemented new guidelines in 2019 to maintain property values and aesthetic consistency. She handed me a thick packet of papers. You have 60 days to submit modification plans that bring your property into compliance, or the non-compliant structure must be removed. I flipped through the page's architectural review forms, fee schedules, contractor approval lists. This wasn't a friendly neighborhood association. This was a bureaucratic machine designed to micromanage every nail and board. What if I don't want to modify it? I asked. Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. Then we'll file for an injunction and have it removed at your expense. I've successfully enforced compliance on 17 properties in the past 2 years, Mr. Coleman. I don't intend to make yours number 18. That night, I called my buddy Dave, who'd been dealing with his own HOA nightmare in Phoenix. Dude, he said, these people are ruthless. They'll make your life hell until you comply or move. My neighbors spent 40 grand fighting them in court and lost. But Dave didn't know what I knew. He didn't know that the Coleman family had more history with Crystal Lake than just one cabin. I spent the next morning in the county records office, pulling files and deeds that hadn't been touched in decades. What I found made me smile for the first time since Margaret's visit. Sometimes, patience and research beat anger and lawyers every single time. The harassment started immediately after my 60-day deadline passed. First, it was Margaret and Carl doing property inspections, walking through my yard with measuring tapes and cameras, documenting every inch of my deck from multiple angles. They'd show up at 7 in the morning on Saturdays when I was trying to sleep in, or at sunset when I was unwinding from the week. Just conducting our due diligence, Mr. Coleman, Margaret would call out sweetly when I stepped outside to confront them, making sure we have proper documentation for our compliance action. Then came the citations. A violation for unapproved exterior lighting because I'd hung string lights around the deck. Another for non-regulation boat storage because my kayaks were stacked against the side of the cabin instead of in a designated storage area. A third for landscaping maintenance deficiency because I'd let the natural lake grasses grow up along my shoreline instead of maintaining a manicured lawn down to the water's edge. Each citation came with a $50 fine. Each fine came with a certified letter explaining my appeal rights and the escalation process if I remained non-compliant. The letters were legal theater designed to intimidate and exhaust rather than resolve. They're trying to bleed you dry with paper cuts, Dave warned during one of our phone calls. Death by 1,000 tiny violations until you give up and comply. But I wasn't giving up. Every evening after work, I'd sit on my non-compliant deck with my unapproved exterior lighting, sipping beer from my kayak-adjacent storage area, and reviewing the documents I'd found at the county office. Margaret Henderson had no idea what kind of hornet's nest she'd kicked. The breaking point came on a perfect Saturday morning in late September. I was hosting my annual end-of-summer party, just a dozen close friends, some grilled food, and acoustic guitar around a small fire pit. Nothing crazy, just good people enjoying a beautiful day by the lake. Around 11 a.m., Margaret appeared at my property line with Carl and Janet in tow, along with 2 people I didn't recognize carrying clipboards and official-looking badges. Mr. Coleman, Margaret's voice cut through the laughter and conversation. This unpermitted gathering exceeds the occupancy limits for non-compliant structures. My friend Sarah, a lawyer from the city, looked up from her lawn chair. Occupancy limits? It's an outdoor deck. The HOA architectural guidelines clearly state that any structure not in compliance with community standards cannot be used for gatherings exceeding 6 people, Carl read from his clipboard like he was reciting scripture. Who are your friends? I asked, nodding toward the 2 badge carriers. Lake County Code Enforcement, Margaret announced triumphantly. They're here to document safety violations and issue citations for unpermitted use of non-compliant structures. That's when I realized Margaret had escalated beyond HOA harassment. She'd brought in outside authorities to shut down my party and potentially condemn my deck entirely. This wasn't about community standards anymore. This was personal warfare. The code enforcement officers were professional but firm. They explained that they'd received multiple complaints about unpermitted construction and unsafe occupancy of a potentially non-compliant structure. While they couldn't immediately condemn the deck without a full inspection, they could issue citations for exceeding safe occupancy limits if the structure wasn't properly permitted. "I'm sorry, folks," I told my guests. "Looks like we need to move this party inside." As my friends reluctantly gathered their things, Margaret stood at my property line with her arms crossed, that sharp smile fixed on her face like she'd just won a chess match. "30 days, Mr. Coleman," she called out, as the last of my guests headed to their cars. Then we proceed with legal action to have that eyesore removed. That night, after everyone had gone home and the cabin was quiet, except for the gentle lapping of lake water against my supposedly non-compliant deck, I made a decision. Margaret Henderson wanted a war. She was about to get one. But it wouldn't be the kind of war she expected. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to my contact at the Lake District Authority, the governmental body responsible for overseeing all waterfront development, dock permits, and shoreline usage around Crystal Lake. The same authority that had been in my family for 37 years. You see, my father didn't just work for municipal water systems. He was the founding director of the Crystal Lake District Authority, established in 1988 to manage the growing development around the lake. When he retired in 2015, I'd been appointed to fill his unexpired term on the 5-member board. I'd been re-elected twice since then, serving as the authority's technical advisor on water management and shoreline development. Margaret Henderson had just declared war on someone who helped write the very regulations she thought she was enforcing. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting of the Lake District Authority. As a quasi-governmental body, we had jurisdiction over anything that touched the lake, including shorelines, docks, boat lifts, and yes, decks that extended over the water. Our authority superseded local HOAs when it came to waterfront development. We need to conduct a compliance review of the Crystal Lake HOA's enforcement actions, I explained to the other board members during our Monday morning conference call. I've received reports that they may be overstepping their authority in matters that fall under our jurisdiction. Board member Patricia Wells, a retired environmental lawyer, was immediately interested. Are they issuing violations for waterfront structures without consulting us? That's what we need to determine, I said, keeping my voice professionally neutral. I recommend we conduct a comprehensive audit of their recent enforcement actions against lakefront properties. The vote was unanimous. Within 48 hours, the Lake District Authority would begin its own investigation into HOA enforcement practices around Crystal Lake. And Margaret Henderson was about to learn that her little kingdom had borders she'd never bothered to map. But first, I had a more immediate problem. Margaret had scheduled what she called a compliance verification meeting for Friday afternoon, essentially a final inspection before she moved forward with legal action to have my deck removed. She'd sent me a certified letter explaining that I could attend with legal representation if desired, and that the HOA board would be making their final determination on my property's compliance status. I had 3 days to turn the tables completely. Wednesday evening, I received the Lake District Authority's preliminary findings via secure email. Patricia had worked fast, and what she'd discovered was explosive. The Crystal Lake HOA had issued violations on 11 different lakefront properties over the past 2 years, claiming authority over docks, boat lifts, shoreline modifications, and waterfront decks. In every single case, they had failed to verify their jurisdiction with the Lake District Authority. More damaging, 3 of the property owners had actually complied with HOA demands and removed or modified structures that were perfectly legal under Lake District regulations. The HOA had essentially scammed them into unnecessary and expensive modifications. But the most interesting discovery was about Margaret Henderson herself. Her own property featured a boathouse that extended 47 feet into the lake, nearly twice the HOA's own 10-foot limit for lakefront structures. When it was built in 2018, she'd obtained proper permits from the Lake District Authority, but somehow forgot to submit architectural review paperwork to her own OA. Thursday morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Jake Morrison, the most thorough property lawyer in the county. The second was to my cousin Mike, who ran the most successful construction company in the area and had been doing lakefront work for 20 years. "I need a detailed structural engineering report on my deck," I told Mike. "Full compliance review, safety analysis, environmental impact assessment, the works." "When do you need it?" "Tomorrow morning." Mike laughed. "You're insane. But lucky for you, I owe your grandfather a favor that's about 30 years overdue." Friday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, perfect weather for what Margaret probably thought would be her moment of triumph. She'd set up the meeting at the community center, a small building near the lake entrance that served as the HOA's unofficial headquarters. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a leather briefcase that contained enough documentation to bury Margaret's case in an avalanche of legal reality. Margaret was already there with her full-board Carl Patterson, clutching his ever-present clipboard, Janet Mills with her phone ready to record, and 2 other board members I recognized but had never met. They'd arranged themselves on one side of a folding table like a tribunal, with an empty chair facing them for the defendant. I didn't sit down. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said, setting my briefcase on the table and opening it with deliberate precision. "Before we discuss my property's compliance status, I think there are some jurisdictional issues we need to address." Margaret's confident smile faltered slightly. "Jurisdictional issues?" "The Lake District Authority has completed a preliminary review of the Crystal Lake HOA's recent enforcement actions," I said, pulling out Patricia's report. "It appears there may be some confusion about which authority has jurisdiction over lakefront structures." I handed copies of the report to each board member. Margaret's face went pale as she read the cover page. "Jurisdictional Analysis, Crystal Lake HOA, Enforcement Actions Preliminary Findings of Regulatory Overreach. This is..." She started, then stopped, clearly reading faster than she wanted to. "The Lake District Authority has exclusive jurisdiction over any structure that extends over or impacts lake water," I continued, "including docks, boat lifts, shoreline modifications, and yes, decks that extend over the water. Your HOA can regulate structures on dry land, but anything touching the lake falls under our authority." Carl looked up from his copy. "Our authority? You work for them?" "I serve on the Lake District Authority Board," I said. "Have for 10 years. My father was the founding director." The room went dead silent, except for the sound of rain pattering against the windows. "The report details 11 properties where your HOA issued violations for structures under Lake District Authority jurisdiction," I continued. "In 3 cases, property owners spent thousands of dollars on unnecessary modifications to legally compliant structures." Margaret's hands were shaking slightly as she turned pages. This doesn't change the fact that your deck exceeds our community guidelines." "Actually, it does." I pulled out Mike's structural engineering report, fresh off the printer that morning. "This is a comprehensive analysis of my deck's compliance with all applicable regulations. Lake District Authority standards, county building codes, state environmental regulations, and federal shoreline management requirements." I handed her the report. "My deck is in full compliance with every regulation that actually applies to it." Janet, still recording on her phone, leaned forward. But our architectural guidelines have no legal authority over waterfront structures, I interrupted. Your HOA can't override state and federal regulations with community guidelines. Margaret was frantically flipping through both reports, her face cycling through confusion, anger, and what looked like the beginning stages of panic. This is. You can't just. There's more, I said, pulling out the final document from my briefcase. The Lake District Authority is launching a formal investigation into potential harassment and illegal enforcement actions by the Crystal Lake HOA. Property owners who were coerced into unnecessary modifications may be entitled to compensation. The room erupted. Carl started sputtering about property values and community standards. Janet stopped recording and started frantically typing on her phone. The other two board members just stared at their copies of the reports, like they were written in a foreign language. But Margaret went completely silent, still reading through the jurisdictional analysis with the focus of someone trying to find a life preserver on a sinking ship. That's when I delivered the knockout punch. "Oh, and Margaret," I said, pulling out one final sheet of paper. The Lake District Authority's review also flagged some interesting findings about board members' own properties. Your boathouse, for example. Her head snapped up. My boathouse. 47 feet of extension into the lake. That's nearly 5 times larger than the 10-foot limit your HOA enforces on everyone else. When did you submit architectural review paperwork for that structure to your own board? The color drained completely from Margaret's face. That's different. I have proper permits from the Lake District Authority. So do I said quietly. My deck was built with proper Lake District permits from the beginning. You've been harassing me for 6 months over a structure that was legally permitted before your HOA even existed. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Carl was demanding to see my permits. Janet was trying to call someone on her phone. The other board members were whispering urgently to each other. And Margaret sat frozen, staring at the papers scattered across the table like someone watching their entire world collapse. The Lake District Authority will be conducting individual compliance reviews with each property owner who received HOA violations, I said, closing my briefcase. Property owners who incurred unnecessary expenses due to jurisdictional overreach may be eligible for compensation through our enforcement fund. I walked toward the door, then turned back for the final twist of the knife. Oh, and Margaret? That compliance verification meeting you mentioned? The Lake District Authority will be conducting our own compliance verification on your boathouse next Tuesday. I'll make sure to send you proper notice. I left them in chaos and drove home through the drizzle, feeling lighter than I had in months. But the real satisfaction was still to come. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret Henderson's carefully constructed HOA kingdom crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The Lake District Authority's investigation revealed a pattern of jurisdictional overreach that bordered on fraud. Property owners who had been bullied into expensive modifications began filing complaints and demanding compensation. Jake Morrison, my property lawyer, reached out to the 3 families who had already complied with bogus HOA demands. All 3 decided to pursue legal action, with Jake representing them pro bono in exchange for the precedent-setting case it would create. The first domino fell when the Johnsons, an elderly couple who had spent $12,000 removing a perfectly legal dock extension, filed suit against the HOA for fraudulent enforcement. The local newspaper picked up the story, running a front-page article titled "HOA Accused of Illegal Enforcement Actions on Lake Properties." Margaret tried to fight back with a letter-writing campaign to all HOA members, claiming that my conflict of interest as a Lake District Authority board member invalidated the investigation. But her own boathouse violation made her look like a hypocrite, and the engineering reports were unassailable. The second domino was Carl Patterson's resignation. Faced with potential personal liability for participating in illegal enforcement actions, he quit the board and publicly distanced himself from Margaret's leadership. In his resignation letter, he claimed he had been misled about the HOA's enforcement authority and relied on legal advice that proved to be incorrect. Janet Mills followed 2 days later, citing philosophical differences with current board leadership. Her resignation letter was shorter but more damning. She had kept detailed records of all board meetings and enforcement actions, and she was turning those records over to the Lake District Authority's investigation. By the end of the month, Margaret Henderson stood alone. The other 2 board members had resigned. The HOA's lawyer had withdrawn from representation, citing irreconcilable conflicts, and the Lake District Authority had issued a formal cease and desist order prohibiting any further HOA enforcement actions on waterfront properties. But the most satisfying moment came on a Tuesday morning in October, when I was sitting on my non-compliant deck, drinking coffee, and watching Margaret meet with the Lake District Authority inspector about her boathouse. From my deck, I had a perfect view of her property across the cove. I watched through binoculars as the inspector, Patricia Wells herself, who had driven up from the county seat, spent 45 minutes measuring, photographing, and documenting Margaret's oversized boathouse. Margaret stood on her own deck, gesticulating wildly and pointing at various structures around the lake, probably trying to argue that everyone else had bigger violations. But Patricia was methodical and professional, documenting everything with the precision of someone who had dealt with hundreds of similar cases. Around noon, Patricia packed up her equipment and handed Margaret an official citation. Even from across the cove, I could see Margaret's shoulders slump in defeat. That afternoon, I received an email from Patricia with the Lake District Authority's final determination. Margaret's boathouse exceeded permitted dimensions by 37 feet and had been modified multiple times without proper permits. She had 30 days to bring the structure into compliance or face daily fines of $500. The cost estimate for modification, $43,000. The irony was delicious. Margaret Henderson, who had spent months terrorizing property owners over minor violations, was facing a legitimate compliance issue that would cost her more than all her victims' modifications combined. But the story wasn't over. 2 weeks later, I received a hand-delivered letter on personal stationery, not HOA letterhead. Margaret's handwriting was less confident than before, with several crossed-out words and corrections. Mr. Coleman, I would like to request a meeting to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to our recent conflicts. I believe there may have been misunderstandings on both sides, and I hope we can work together to find a solution that serves the entire community's interests. I almost laughed out loud. After months of harassment, threats, and intimidation, Margaret was asking for a meeting to discuss mutually beneficial resolutions. The woman who had tried to destroy my deck with a sledgehammer was now asking for my help. I waited 3 days before responding, then sent a brief reply. Margaret, I am willing to meet, but any discussion must include your acknowledgement of the HOA's jurisdictional overreach and a commitment to compensate affected property owners. Let me know when you're ready for that conversation. Her response came back the same day, yes. We met the following Sunday at a neutral location, the public boat launch at the north end of the lake. Margaret looked like she had aged 5 years in 5 weeks. Her perfect silver hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her HOA polo had been replaced with a plain sweater, and she carried herself with the defeated posture of someone who had lost a war she thought she was winning. "Thank you for meeting with me," she started, her voice lacking its previous authority. "What do you want to discuss?" She took a deep breath. "The HOA's insurance company is recommending we settle all potential claims before this goes to court. They're concerned about our liability exposure." Smart Insurance Company. The Lake District Authority's investigation found that I made mistakes in determining our enforcement authority. The admission came out like she was pulling teeth. We're prepared to offer compensation to affected property owners and revise our architectural guidelines to properly respect jurisdictional boundaries. I waited. This was her show now. I need your help, she said finally. As a Lake District Authority board member, you have credibility with the affected families. If you could recommend a reasonable settlement structure, I think we can resolve this without destroying the HOA entirely. There it was. The woman who had tried to destroy my property with a sledgehammer was asking me to save her organization from the consequences of her own actions. What about your boathouse? Her face crumpled slightly. I'm selling it. The modification costs are more than I can afford, and… She paused, struggling with the words. I can't ask the community to trust me on compliance issues when I have my own violations. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or deception. But all I saw was genuine defeat and what looked like shame. Here's what I'm willing to do, I said finally. I'll work with Jake Morrison to develop a fair settlement framework for affected property owners. Full compensation for unnecessary modifications, plus reasonable damages for harassment and legal costs. In exchange, the HOA revises its architectural guidelines to clearly acknowledge Lake District Authority jurisdiction and implements proper review procedures. And my boathouse. That's between you and the Lake District Authority. I'll make sure you get the same fair treatment as any other property owner, but I can't give you special consideration. Margaret nodded slowly. That's more than fair. Thank you. The settlement negotiations took 6 weeks, but the final resolution was comprehensive and satisfying. The Crystal Lake HOA paid $137,000 in compensation to affected property owners, revised their architectural guidelines to properly respect jurisdictional boundaries, and implemented new procedures requiring Lake District Authority consultation on all waterfront enforcement actions. Margaret Henderson resigned as HOA president and sold her lake property, using the proceeds to pay for her boathouse modifications and her share of the settlement costs. The new HOA board was elected on a platform of collaborative community management and respect for property owner rights. As for my deck, it remains exactly as it was, extending proudly over the lake with its built-in benches, rose planters, and hot tub. Every morning, I sit there with my coffee, watching the sun rise over Crystal Lake and listening to the gentle lap of water against the cedar pilings. The string lights still twinkle in the evenings. My kayaks are still stacked against the cabin. The natural grasses still grow along my shoreline, providing habitat for the ducks and herons that make this place magical. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings when the mist is rising off the lake, I think about Margaret Henderson and wonder if she learned anything from our battle. I hope she did. I hope she learned that power without wisdom is just bullying, and that every kingdom has borders its ruler doesn't control. But mostly, I just enjoy my coffee, my non-compliant deck, and the knowledge that sometimes patience and preparation beat anger and authority every single time. The funny thing is, I never wanted a war with the HOA. All I wanted was to enjoy my grandfather's cabin and the deck we built together. But Margaret Henderson taught me an important lesson. When someone tries to destroy something you love, you don't just defend it. You make sure they never have the power to threaten anyone else again. And next summer, I'm thinking about adding a larger hot tub to the deck. With proper Lake District Authority permits, of course. Because unlike some people, I actually know which regulations apply to my property. I think Grandpa Joe would have been proud. He always said the best defense is a good offense, and the best offense is knowing the rules better than the people trying to use them against you. The deck is still here. Margaret Henderson is not. Sometimes, that's exactly how justice is supposed to work.